Hello, welcome back to the webinar series Deep Dive organized by the Open Source Initiative. We'll be hearing from Monica Lopez, and she's going to be talking about preempting the risks of generative AI, and she's going to give us some suggestions of best practices for open source AI initiatives. We're going to be taking questions at the end. Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you for tuning in for this webinar presentation. I'm Dr. Monica Lopez, the co-founder and chief executive officer at Cognitive Insights for Artificial Intelligence. And I'm going to be speaking on preempting the risks of generative AI, responsible best practices for open source AI initiatives. To start, I want to highlight that the proliferation and use of AI-enabled technologies, particularly in the area of generative AI and with language processing, poses two intersecting challenges that I'm going to break down and propose solutions for. The first is the influencing of our beliefs, as in us as human beings. And the second is the engendering of new means for nefarious intent to be pursued. But first, we have to step back and ask ourselves, how did these two challenges that I just mentioned come about? Why is this the environment that we find ourselves in right now? The anthropomorphization of generative AI systems, and of particular focus here on large language models, or LLMs, is not the solution. We are fundamentally dealing with intelligent systems that do not understand the content they generate, nor the world around them. This inherently raises a host of problems when these systems are integrated within our day-to-day human world built by humans for humans, that developers and the general public alike hadn't fully anticipated until now. And this was, of course, in part because such a large live experiment of millions of users using this technology at once hadn't been done before. And I want to underscore what we empirically know about the introduction of AI-enabled large language models in the real world. First, the internal architecture of generative AI is incapable of distinguishing fact from fiction. Second, these models regularly produce hallucinations and fabricate information. Third, these models contain known racial, gender, and class stereotypes and biases from their training data and other structural factors, which then downstream into model outputs. Fourth, these models generate fluent, confident-sounding, perfect, and in particular, English language responses that are not human-like in their communication capabilities. Human-to-human conversation and communication is far more varied. It's filled with clauses of uncertainty, with corrections, even pauses, and spaced out delays. Fifth, generative AI systems have no knowledge of any of what I just mentioned. So the self-correction, the explaining, the real-time behavioral adaptability that we engage in is not possible in these systems. And sixth, to reiterate, these systems are not human-like. Which brings me back to the challenges that I started with and will reiterate. One, the influencing of our beliefs by the use and proliferation of generative AI technology. And two, the engendering of new means for nefarious intent, also as a result of the use and proliferation of this technology. To begin with the first challenge, we have to understand why our beliefs are vulnerable. The formation of our beliefs from a subset of available data from the environment is critical for survival. It's essential to us being able to decide the benefit or disadvantage of something for our needs. And while beliefs can change with the introduction of new data, like something that could highlight the disadvantage of a previously perceived advantage, the context in which such data emerges and the manner in which such data are communicated all matter. Just think about how our live dynamic interactions with each other underpin our exchange of information and the subsequent development of beliefs. Generative AI models are not live systems, and they are incapable of evaluating information like we do. Research also shows that repeated exposure to fabricated information predicts how deeply ingrained the belief in that information becomes. So greater repetition predicts greater strength in a person's belief in a particular statement. We also know that the greater the level of uncertainty someone has about a topic, the more influenceable they are as they go about searching for information precisely to decrease that uncertainty. And finally, as classic as the chatbot Eliza is, when Weizenbaum introduced his language processing system at MIT in 1966, humans readily assign agency and intentionality to human-like intelligence and emergent sentience. Having identified these characteristics, and given the purpose of these webinars to provide us specific solutions to problems, I want to jump right into a few from the psychological perspective. And there are two that I propose. First, a new narrative is needed. The overhyped, exaggerated, and unrealistic claims that have come from the many players of the AI ecosystem, from developers and companies to the media and public figures alike, all need to be toned down. The same needs to be done for the anthropomorphic generalization of these systems' capabilities. How we talk about these systems, the words we use, all contribute to the popular misconception that these models exceed human-level reasoning and therefore human capabilities. And we need to be thoughtful in how that can exacerbate the risk of false information being transmitted. Second, the understanding of human beliefs, some observations which I mentioned, needs to be integrated into system audits and impact assessments. And determining the impact of generative models on human beliefs and biases can be done through tangible measurements, like determining users' rating of the system's knowledge as compared to their own, as well as determining users' trust or level of confidence in what the system has outputted, all encapsulated in determining the user's usage of the system's generated content. Now, I want to look at the second challenge, the engendering of new means for nefarious intent, also as a result of the use and proliferation of this technology. Generative AI can aid in deceptive behavior, and we must ask why and how. Because deception, or strategies used to manipulate others, to withhold the truth, and to create false impressions for personal gain, becomes an action further amplified by impersonal, rapid, automated means of expression, in which the human controls their intent to deceive. But we also have to consider the AI agent's own learned behavior. Whether AI systems have or will ever have a theory of mind. In multiple agent AI systems, for example, some agents can learn deceptive behaviors without having any appreciation or even comprehension at all of what deception entails. This could be expressed through such behavior as hiding resources or information, or providing false information to achieve a particular goal. Moreover, what this highlights is that generative AI and open source tools open the door to three types of risks. That of misuse, or bad actors purposefully using the technology to conduct illicit behavior at scale. That of accident, or developers and companies and organizations making and using the tech to innovate and inadvertently causing a harm or multiple harms at scale. And that which is structural, or those risks that are inherently part of the system itself, that are known but not fully understood, and yet a trade-off is made to innovate over prioritizing the system's safety. So to propose a second solution, from the psychological perspective, we must recognize as a fact of the present situation that AI systems deceive. Whether they will ever have a theory of mind or not, or human-like intent or not, AI systems will continue to act as a complement to deceitful humans and deceive. And that mindset can help with further identifying the right type of questions that we need to ask, and thus risk management methods to employ, that otherwise we would not think about to mitigate the unwanted deception. For example, across which environments do we want to prevent deception? Which problems do we need to optimize? And how do AI agents learn from one another? And what can we learn from emergent effects about unwanted deceptive behaviors? Now, we could say, well, open sourcing AI systems is the way to go. The benefits and opportunities are significant and plenty. It democratizes access to technology where now many developers from all kinds of organizations and geographies can have access. It speeds up collaborations, otherwise impossible, helps with spotting vulnerabilities, and thus aids in the fight against AI bias and the identification of malicious code. It encourages transparency and an environment of learning, facilitating model documentation and also the auditability of models. And it generates community norms and AI standards to overcome interoperability issues. And ultimately, it supports innovation efforts. But the availability and access also means that anyone can download and modify the model, for example, to their specific liking. Companies with or without the right amount of resources can build on them and customize as needed. And because there are lower barriers to entry, quality and value can decrease in the race to adopt AI systems. And the reality is that proliferation is outpacing regulation. Now, before I mention solutions, there's value in briefly bringing up Poison GPT and Worm GPT, because they reveal the dangers of model traceability and the complex nature of data and algorithm provenance, particularly in the context of open source models and platforms. As we know, advanced AI models require not just technical expertise, but substantial resources to train. So many developers and others are and will turn to external parties for pre-trained models to alleviate costs and data requirements for use in their particular use cases. As many of us know, Poison GPT is a great example of how Mithril Security surgically modified an open source model, GPT J6B, to make it spread misinformation on a specific task, but not on other tasks, and then distributed the model on Hugging Face to compromise the supply chain of LLMs and spread misinformation at scale. Given the significance of this problem, it has led to the development of an open source tool to provide cryptographic proof of model provenance. Another example is Worm GPT, which automates phishing emails and facilitates business email compromise attacks by essentially generating human-like text based on the input it receives, all in multiple languages. It was presented as a black hat alternative to GPT models and designed specifically for malicious activities. What makes it so important as an example is how openly available it is, offering a ChatGPT-like system without any ethical boundaries or limitations. Which brings me to solutions. And from an ethical perspective, we can focus on the issues of transparency, fairness, and accountability as they relate to current proposals and debate. Most recently now, for example, in the United States, surrounding the need for the standardization of metrics, the establishment of certifications and oversight boards, and licensing requirements, and also the importance of international cooperation. Regarding transparency, we need to ensure at least the 4 categories. Data transparency, which must at least include the source of the data, the rights of use of the data model that developers have to train the model with, and with the use of reinforcement learning with human feedback techniques, how labeling is being done needs to be made explicit. Also, code transparency. Open source LLMs should have their source code publicly available, allowing for others to review, to scrutinize, and to verify it so that modification, if and when necessary, can be implemented and documented accordingly. Also, model behavior transparency. All the capabilities and limitations of use and performance must be identified and cataloged, including any potential biases and mitigation strategies. And finally, stakeholder transparency. The intended audience at which transparency requirements are directed, including their level of expertise, also plays an important role in determining how best to explain model capability. Regarding fairness, I will enumerate at least 3 fundamental points. First, bias mitigation. Open source LLMs can and will inherit biases from their training data. So proactively assessing structural bias becomes a must. Second, diverse training data. Training data needs to be diverse and representative of the real world, and then continuously checked for representation. And third, non-bias effectiveness. What works in a test case doesn't necessarily scale in the real world and across time. So the effectiveness of the system has to be evaluated in real time, not only accepted as a fair system because bias was removed to comply, for example, with low and minimal thresholds of acceptability, as seen in some emerging relevant laws. Regarding accountability, I will specify at least 5 points. First, the system's relevancy and utility is paramount. A question that often doesn't get asked enough is the suitability of the use of an AI system in the first place. Is it actually relevant? And what utility does it bring that otherwise would be impossible without it? Second, model responsibility. Developers of open source LLMs need to take responsibility for the impact of their models on society. We can no longer be naive to the inherent structural and accidental risks of these models, including addressing and rectifying any harm caused by the misuse of the model. Third, governance and oversight. This may involve setting up committees or boards, as calls have been made for by governments, including the emergence already of national oversight bodies responsible for making decisions related to model behavior, model ethics, and model use cases. Fourth, user education. Developers and their organizations should provide clear guidelines and educational resources to help users understand how to use the models responsibly and ethically, especially as more and more non-expert users engage with this technology. And fifth, the continuous independent audits. The dynamic nature of these systems require that we periodically conduct audits of model behavior to identify and address any ethical concerns or issues that may arise over time, in which updating training data, refining algorithms, and incorporating feedback from the community becomes inevitable. From the technical perspective, I argue that we have to fundamentally attest to reliability. We must be able to confidently certify that the system does X in Y context and only X in Y context. And I identify here at least 4 methods. First, input filtering. We must implement input filtering mechanisms to reject or neutralize harmful or inappropriate inputs. This, of course, entails that we have clear our human values as well, as in the case of national security, our national values, which, for example, in the US, are centered on not threatening individual rights and freedoms. Second, adversarial testing. We must conduct red teaming assessments and use adversarial testing to uncover vulnerabilities and improve the model's resistance to manipulation. Third, integration of a user feedback loop. We must establish a user-friendly mechanism for users to report problematic outputs or biases that they encounter. Then they must analyze this feedback. Well, we must analyze this feedback to identify issues and make necessary improvements to the model. This relates back most directly to the impact assessment measurements that I mentioned earlier regarding the effect of generative model outputs on human beliefs and biases. And fourth, real-time global performance tracking. We need to establish a standard for global AI model tracking. And one way to accomplish this is by publicly presenting all the above metrics that I mentioned and their changes in real time on a global map. This would enable a visible living record of missteps and improvements. Now, before I conclude, I want to introduce an important caveat, that of benchmarks. As these systems advance and LLMs form the basis of smart language systems, we have to be clear about the goals we want the AI system to hit. And benchmarks provide a definition for what we want our AI tool to do and how to move towards those goals. All the above ethical and technical requirements of transparency, fairness, accountability, and reliability I broke down depend on clearly defined and agreed upon benchmarks. And research reveals that current benchmarks of performance are only minimally improving across a range of tasks, suggesting that we need new benchmarks. And more significantly, we need to address the elephant in the room, which is, what exactly do we want our AI tools to do for us? What constitutes accomplishing the goal we want the system to reach? And what revisions do we need to thus make to our benchmarks now so that they satisfy the concerns I have addressed about the malleability of our beliefs and the introduction of new means from malicious actors? The gold standard is and remains with human judgment. And we humans are the ones consuming and interpreting generative AI outputs, reminding us that subjectivity plays a role. Crowdsourced human evaluation may be our best bet yet. In conclusion, we have to balance the vulnerabilities of human evaluative judgment with the strengths of human technical innovation. And the way to do this is through an interdisciplinary, holistic solution whereby psychological, ethical, and technical perspectives are brought together, each guided by a risk management framework. And last but not least, I am ultimately advocating for human control, both in our challenges and questions and in our solutions. Humans are and must remain at the center of the problem and the solution. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions during the live Q&A.